Hello, everyone, and welcome to the WRA interview. My name is Sandil, and I am the Portfolio Director for Europe for the World Refining Association. Today, I have with me John Cooper, who is Director General for FuelsEurope and Concawe. John was appointed Director General for FuelsEurope and Concawe in April 2015. He started his career in the motor industry, working on future powertrains, and after 3 years, moved to BP Downstream, where he spent 27 years. His previous role was leading BP's compliance strategy forwards with renewables regulation. John has also had business leadership roles in aviation fuels and lubricants, transport energy policy, and fuels technology in the UK and USA, and has represented the UK fuels industry at the UK Automotive Council Technology Group. John is a chartered engineer and a fellow of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. So, with all that in mind, before we get into the hot refining topics at the moment, how are you doing, John? How is the lockdown environment treating you?
Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to do this interview. Lockdown, well, it's been strange for everybody. Suddenly thrust into a world of working remotely with teams, with the external stakeholders that we work with, and a whole new world where business is extremely disrupted. And I think it's interesting to reflect that even in January, shall we say, of this year in Europe, nobody could quite imagine what April would look like. And it's been one of those things where the unimaginable suddenly becomes your reality. So
Yeah.
we've all been on the journey. We've all got different flavors on it. But me and my family, we've been some of the lucky ones. We really haven't been affected. We know some people have been very badly affected. It continues to be a very serious thing that we've got to manage together.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when we bring COVID-19 impact, like how is it actually affecting the refining community that you work so closely with? How is it looking in the short and medium term?
Well, we worked actually on behalf of the industry a lot in the first few weeks, managing business continuity, just little things like getting truckers across borders, getting maintenance crews across borders, etc. And so we were part of helping to manage that, managing seasonal changeovers of gasoline, for example. Lots of things that were suddenly challenges in the short term. But I think actually the industry has managed very well in terms of supply. It's maintained supply. There's really been no challenge to supply anywhere. Of course, the big story has been what has happened to demand. And we've seen demand across the board reduce, but in very varied ways. Aviation, I mean, jet has just disappeared in terms of demand, largely, with whole fleets of aircraft just stopped. Passenger cars and personal transport was stopped significantly for about 2 months, but is starting to come back. Whereas trucking, a lot of commercial stuff did continue. And of course, things like home delivery have actually become even more important. So it's been very patchy changes. We've also seen deeper demand destruction in North and West Europe, mostly, certainly in Western Europe. And Central and Eastern has generally seen a little less impact on the demand.
And so with COVID-19, everyone's talking about the now and the impact, but after it's all done, the question of behavioral habits changing has come to the fore. How do you think that will shape up?
Well, we are certainly seeing a significant move towards more flexible working and home working, and that could mean less personal transport for commuting. On the other hand, there seems to be a bias towards using the personal car for transport for social reasons, shall we say.
Yeah.
It's early days. It looks like it'll be a long time before jet demand comes back. Many companies are putting restrictions on business travel and have discovered how to do business remotely. And so we expect business travel, but also social airplane travel to be significantly affected. I think those are the biggest points out of all that.
Yeah.
Behavioural change. I mean, I think the other thing that's interesting for us is that perhaps there's a certain mindset of being open to more significant change in the way society and the economy works in future. And we see that is encouraging some parts of the policy bubble to say, let's not recover back to the old normal. Let's try and recover to a newer normal. And that's a very worthy sentiment, but when you're in the industry hot seat, it's also quite challenging as well. And so
Okay.
that's become part of the conversation, how to do a green recovery. And expectations that there tend to be very short term. And there's something about managing expectations with that.
Yeah, and this kind of leads on to the question of this public opinion, where we're seeing many in favor now of renewables and electric cars, and wanting it to happen at a much quicker pace. How can refineries and Fuels Europe convince society that there are alternative ways that this transition can go?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, first of all, let me start by saying we should all recognize that renewable electricity from wind and solar are really important. They are the great new resource and have got significant growth and significant scope also in being inexpensive in the long run. But they are very different as energy sources from molecules. And we do think that there's a lot more thinking and technology development to be done to satisfy all the needs of the energy demand we've got in Europe with the utility and the flexibility we've got today. Instantaneous electrons from wind and solar do not do the job of the 90 days of storage we've got of gas and of oil products today, and the sheer practicality of being able to fuel lots of different vehicles with liquids, liquid fuels, the fact that we've got all of that infrastructure in place, and it's going to be a long time before we can replace that. Electric cars are really good. Electric cars are getting better and better. They have extraordinary political support, because they are a good fit. The whole idea of an electric car connected to a windmill is absolutely an attractive idea. And we've talked in the work that we've done in the association long and hard. We've recognized that the electric car and electric batteries to power transport will have a very significant role in the future. But we've also taken the view that they can't necessarily do everything that liquids can do. And certainly when you get to the more energy intense forms of transport, it becomes pretty obvious when you look at even the most basic numbers. We put a slide together last year which showed what it takes to make a long haul jet, make a wide body long haul jet, make a long journey, about 100 tons of jet fuel. And a similar quantity of energy supplied with batteries would require 2,000 tons of batteries. And that's the best graphic illustration. We've had that retweeted by MEPs, etc., several times. That's the extreme example. And the takeaway from that for us is aircraft will need liquids as energy for as long as we can possibly imagine at the moment. And the same is true to some extent for shipping and also for heavy duty transport on the roads. It's also possible that there could be a competitive solution for some light transport, cars or light commercial as well, simply because liquids are the best form of energy storage and delivery. They simply still are. And there will be modes and customers that prefer having the flexibility, the very long range, and the existing use of existing infrastructure that using a liquid would enable. So while we've come to terms with the fact that the long-term outlook for the refining industry is very different from what it is today, we still say that there's a role for a liquid fuel and that there's a role for refinery sites in providing those. And there's a role for the existing infrastructure as well, because we perhaps have underestimated the value of the infrastructure we have, which today runs from every refinery, every terminal, every deep water port, to the side of every vehicle, almost everything that moves in Europe, be it a car or a ship or a plane or a truck. And that's an extraordinary statement to be able to make, and to be able to say, and by the way, we've got 90 days of energy storage sorted as well. As I say, we've taken it for granted, and we think if you try and replicate that with electrons, you'll end up with something that's extremely expensive and still not as good as what we've got today. So we think there's a role for multiple different technologies, and that's at the heart of the work that we've done.
When you mentioned the MEPs and doing their retweeting and how engaged they are, when we look at the Commission's Green Deal, do you think it's going to hold up in light of COVID-19's impact on government budgets, or are you going to see a different makeup of this?
In short, I do think it'll hold up, but it is work in progress. There's still a lot to be done, and you can see a lot of tensions politically around that. There is the whole significant camp that says a recovery must be a green recovery. There are other camps that say we simply need to recover the economy back to where we are. There's also a shortage of cash in many quarters. How this will be paid for is still not entirely clear. And by the way, I mean, there's some overlap between the recovery strategy of the European Union and the Green Deal. Mm-hmm. And the long-term objectives are described by the Green Deal, the short-term objectives by the recovery plan. But there are many stakeholders to say that they should be very clearly connected with some overlap.
Yeah. And so what are the policies that you think will make it work?
So I'm going to come back to the point that we say that actually there's a role for liquids long-term, as long as they've got a pathway to be renewable, completely renewable in the long term. Yeah. But we think there's a pathway for every one of the sectors of transport. At the moment, there's a strong consensus that we do need renewable jet fuel for aviation, and we probably need renewable liquid maritime fuel as well. There's some consensus around that for heavy-duty transport, but it becomes quite controversial for cars, because the assumption is that everything can go to electricity in cars, and relatively quickly too. We make the point that while we do think electricity in cars is very, very good, they still require significant policy support. If you look at all the different levels of support, starting with the very strong measures on car makers, through to the grants that are given for purchases of an electric car, the fact that there's no taxation on the use of electricity in cars, and then all the other smaller things that still add up, like low-cost parking, free parking, possibly use of bus lanes, etc. If you add it all up, it's easily thousands over the life of the car, and in some cases, in some countries, it's tens of thousands. That's what it takes to get a new technology up to scale. But you work that out in carbon cost terms, it's very high. And actually, our own work shows that low carbon liquids are competitive with that already. And they offer some different types of utility. But we've got to think through, how do you provide the policy support? So back to your question, what policies do we need? Yeah. Well, one of the first things we would say is we do need some kind of product standard or different sort of carbon pricing for renewables in fuels. We don't think it's the ETS of Europe that will do this, because the ETS currently has a carbon price of around 25 euros. And we'll be quite clear, any type of industrial improvement is going to come in far higher than ETS from now on. It's 3-digit numbers. But those are already available in road transport. And that's one of the key reasons we say we should make this work in road transport. Road transport can be the critical lead market to get this set of technologies scaled up. One of the asides that I would give would be to say, if we'd only targeted this at aviation, given that the aviation demand is very, very low at the moment, and most aviation operators are in severe financial difficulties, it would not be an attractive proposition to try to invest to supply only renewable aviation fuel today. It's more affordable in road transport. And so back to, how do you do carbon pricing at higher numbers? One of the first ideas we say is, look at the way we do fuel tax at the moment. It's not described as a carbon tax. And in fact, it's actually levied whether that fuel today is a biofuel or an advanced biofuel or 100% petroleum, it's levied at the same rate. It's typically on a per litre basis for petrol and diesel. If you worked out the cost in carbon terms, if it was a carbon price, it would be around 200 euros a tonne of carbon, which is already a very useful carbon price for supporting these investments. So a simple change that we are already asking for is to say, let's turn it into a carbon price so that a very low carbon renewable fuel pays little or no tax compared with the petroleum portion. That's a fairly easy change to make, and that's something we're already in discussions with at member state level and European Commission level. And we've had some quite positive reception for that idea. The other idea is some kind of fuel standard could be along the lines of how the Renewable Energy Directive works today, or it could be something in terms of a dedicated system like an ETS for transport that could make that work, but something that delivers consistently a high carbon price with a trajectory for where you need to get to. Thirdly, as we're reducing the carbon intensity of the fuels, we say it needs to be reflected in the way vehicles are rated for CO2 performance. Today, if you buy a vehicle, the vehicle has been tested on a test cycle which ignores the biogenic content, carbon content of any fuel, any biofuel or renewable fuel that's in there. And so as we're proposing to go down this pathway towards zero fossil carbon and 100% renewable or circular carbon, it's crazy to have a system that doesn't recognize that. So let me talk you through an example there. If you buy a mid-size hatchback today, it may have a rating of 100 grams per kilometer. That is a measurement that assumes that all the carbon comes out of the tailpipe is 100% fossil carbon. Let's say at some point in the future we reduce that carbon intensity by 20%. Our argument, our proposal would be that you have a factor that applies to that number. So you would reduce the carbon intensity of the car by 20%. So you'd have an 80-gram car rather than a 100-gram car. And the 20-gram improvement is delivered by the fuel. There's lots of thinking to do to make that methodology become real and available to customers. But it's absolutely within reach to do that in the next few years. So it's something about tax, something about the fuel standards, and something about the way vehicle CO2 is done. And the long-term objective for the investor is to give a very clear signal in terms of the demand and the way the costs of the product would be supported, so that you can make your billion-dollar investment for each plant with a clear, at least 10-year timeline to see how you would make that work. And then it's got to work for the end customer as well, where they can see, I've now got a choice. It could be a 100% electrically powered vehicle, or it could be a vehicle that uses substantial portions of renewable fuel, with eventually an option for that to be 100% renewable.
This leads nicely onto the investor influence, and we're seeing that Shell, Repsol, and BP have already announced their target to be carbon neutral by 2050, obviously aligning with the Green Deal as well.
Yes.
I wondered, working with these guys on a regular basis, how are they viewing it as well? Is there an alignment with your Clean Fuels for All report?
Well, those are three members of FuelsEurope and the science organization Concawe, and our members, those and other members, have been deeply involved in this work. It's collaborative work, teamwork to have put all this together, both in terms of the technology pathways and the policy proposals as well. And I guess one of the things I would say is it's important to recognize our work covers scope 2 and scope 3 emissions, as it's now described in the jargon of the subject. And these companies have all made clear statements about both of those. Our work is substantially around reducing the scope 2, the manufacturing emissions, the emissions from the site, the manufacturing site, to take those towards zero. And then also the combustion emissions, scope 3, to take those on a life cycle basis to zero through the use of either captured carbon or biogenic carbon in the manufacturing. It's, as far as we can see, it's completely aligned.
That's a good sign. And then with those that you have aligned with, I want to bring up the fact that there are those who haven't or are not aligning with this methodology and view for 2050. So what will happen to the European refiners who have not already begun introducing your recommendations? Will they become obsolete?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is each company has its own commercial strategy. Our work is to provide a policy framework that every business can plan around. And we've jointly worked up a policy framework around a vision of what technologies can be part of the long-term future of Europe. It's important to recognize also that we've described a trajectory where petroleum gradually tapers down towards zero by 2050, not unlike how electricity was produced 10, 15, 20 years ago, where it was predominantly coal. In the transition years, there's a role for many different types of producer. The impact on demand can be anticipated by the policy trajectory that the European Commission and the Green Deal sets out. That's clear to everybody. It's also clear that in a climate neutral world that the role for petroleum is likely to be very small. That's clear to everybody regardless of our work. You can ask the companies individually, but along the way, there will be some remaining demand for petroleum for many years to come.
When I'm thinking about ERTC in November, and the central theme is technology, which of the following do you see as having the potential to have the biggest impact on the refining industry? We've got low carbon fuels, hydrogen and CCUS in one, and chemical recycling. Out of all of these, which are going to make the big impact?
Well, I hope I'm not going to disappoint you. The way we've described this technology pathway overall is to say there isn't a single silver bullet. I'm old enough to remember for many decades stories coming through where there would be a newspaper headline saying, here's the silver bullet that replaces petroleum. My earliest recollection is the story of the water-powered car, which was, of course, actually the hydrogen-powered car. But there's been various iterations along the way. Biofuels at one point was raised as the silver bullet that simply replaces petroleum. And our takeaway is that there isn't a single silver bullet. The pathway we put together was to put down building blocks where every building block does a few percent of the job. And that's exactly what we've done, setting out all of those technologies and even the subdivisions of those technologies. So biofuels breaks down into some remaining sustainable first generation biofuels, but then various different types of advanced biofuels based on different types of feedstock and also different types of production processes. Every one does a few percent. There isn't enough resource to take any one of those to completely replace petroleum. So it's actually a bit of all of them. Every one of them plays a role, and in fact their role can also evolve. CCS, or the refining site, in the first place would be capturing fossil carbon emissions to take the refinery site emissions down to zero. In the long term, we envisage that the refinery, any combustion at the refinery would be of biomass, and then the captured carbon would be biogenic carbon, which you then store. You've then got a negative emissions manufacturing site. And so we see a transition in the role of the technologies and a role with all of them fitting together.
It's not a disappointing answer because I can see the direction you're going. So thank you for that. Overall, I think these are the questions I wanted to ask. I want to say thank you for your time. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, just thanks for the opportunity. We're looking forward to sharing this more with folks at ERTC.
Great. All right, John, thanks a lot and have a good day.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.